My name is Nathan. I'm 31 years old and I live in Portland, Oregon. And I want to tell you about the week my family buried my father, and then, before the flowers on his grave had time to wilt, began dismantling everything he had spent 40 years building. My father's name was James Arthur Calloway. He was 64 years old when he died, which is not old enough, not remotely, not by any measure I'm willing to accept. And he died on a Tuesday morning in late September in the bedroom of the house he had owned for 31 years, with morning light coming through the curtains he had hung himself, and the sound of the neighbor's maple tree moving in the wind outside the window. My mother was with him. I was 40 minutes away, driving as fast as I could after the phone call, and I did not make it in time. I have thought about those 40 minutes many times since. I have made my peace with them, mostly. The funeral was on a Friday. My father had not been a large presence in a room kind of man. He was quiet, deliberate, the kind of person whose significance you felt most clearly in his absence rather than his presence, which I suppose is true of the best kind of people. He had built things his whole life: furniture, cabinets, bookshelves, frames, small, beautiful objects that existed in dozens of homes across Portland and beyond, made by his hands in the workshop behind the property on Alderwood Road that he had purchased in 1987, and which was, in every sense that mattered, his second home. His real home, some people who knew him well might have argued, though my mother would have disagreed with that characterization, and she would not have been entirely wrong. The church held maybe 90 people. His woodworking clients came. Some of them had commissioned pieces from him for 20, 25 years, and they sat in the pews with the particular grief of people who have lost not just a person, but a relationship they had not fully understood the value of until it ended. His friends from the neighborhood, his brother, my Uncle Paul, who had flown in from Denver and who was the only person at the reception afterward who talked about my father the way I knew my father, with the specific, unguarded joy of someone telling stories that are so true they make you laugh and cry at the same time. I sat in the front pew between my mother and my brother Connor, and I held myself together the way you hold yourself together at a funeral, when you are the kind of person who does not cry in public. Not from pride or performance, but from the deep, structural habit of a person who learned early to keep his most important feelings in the quietest possible place. I would cry later, alone, in my car, in the parking lot of the church after everyone had gone, but not there, not then. Connor is 4 years older than me. He's 35, broad-shouldered, confident in the way that oldest children in certain families are confident, as though the world has always been arranged slightly in their favor, and they have simply come to expect it. He works in commercial real estate, which is relevant, as you will soon understand. He and my father had a relationship that was correct and functional, and not particularly warm. They did not share a language, my father and Connor, the way my father and I shared a language. Connor had never had any interest in the workshop, in the craft, in the long Saturday mornings of sawdust and wood grain, and the specific meditative silence of a man who communicates through making things. That was always mine. The workshop was always mine, in every way except legally. And that distinction between what is emotionally yours and what is legally yours is precisely where this story lives. The reception was at the house on Birchwood Court, my parents' home, the one I had grown up in, the one that still smelled in its specific and unchangeable way like my entire childhood. People brought food. There was too much of it, the way there is always too much food at these gatherings, as though abundance is the only language available when words run short. I moved through the rooms in the particular days of early grief, present and absent simultaneously, registering faces and voices and condolences with one part of my mind, while another remained entirely elsewhere, in the workshop, in the memory of my father's hands on a piece of walnut, in the last real conversation we had 3 weeks before he died, when he had said something I did not fully understand at the time, and which would only clarify itself weeks later. He had said, "Nathan, when I go, and I know it's sooner than either of us wants, don't let them rush things. You hear me? Don't let them rush. I had told him to stop talking like that. He had looked at me with the patient, affectionate exasperation of a man who has something important to say and watching the other person deflect it. "Promise me," he said. "Dad." "Nathan, promise me." I promised, I said. I did not know then what I was promising. I understand now that he knew exactly what he was asking for and why. It started that evening, the same evening as the reception. I was in the kitchen helping my mother's friend Diane put away dishes when I heard Connor's voice from the hallway, low, the tone he used when he was in professional mode, which was a tone I had always found vaguely unsettling in a domestic context, like finding a briefcase at a dinner table. He was on the phone. I caught fragments. The Alderwood property, yes, commercial zoning. I have a contact who's been interested for 2 years. I think now is the right time to move. I stood very still in the kitchen doorway. Diane said something to me. I did not hear it. The Alderwood property, my father's workshop, the building where James Arthur Calloway had spent the better part of 40 years making things that outlasted him, teaching his younger son the vocabulary of wood and patience, and the particular satisfaction of building something with your hands that will exist after you are gone. Connor was on the phone with a buyer's contact the day of his father's funeral reception. I set down the dish I was holding carefully because I knew, with the specific full-body certainty of a person whose instincts have just been confirmed by evidence, that if I did not set it down carefully, I would not set it down carefully. I went outside. I sat on the back porch steps in a September evening, the air cool and slightly damp the way Portland evenings are, and I looked at the neighbor's fence and the strip of darkening sky above it. Don't let them rush things. Dad, I understand now. I understand what you were telling me. I did not confront Connor that evening. I want to explain why, because I think it matters to the shape of what followed. I did not confront him that night, at the reception, in grief, without information, without knowing what he had actually planned or set in motion, because confronting him that night, at the reception, in grief, without information, without knowing what he had actually planned or set in motion, would have produced heat and noise and no resolution. I had watched Connor operate my whole life. He was not a man who responded to emotional confrontation with remorse or recalibration. He responded to it by consolidating his position and waiting for the emotional person to exhaust themselves. I was not going to exhaust myself. Instead, I went home that night to my apartment in Portland, 40 minutes from the house where my father had died 4 days earlier, and I sat at my kitchen table and I thought very carefully about what I knew and what I needed to know. What I knew, Connor had made a phone call about the Alderwood property on the day of the funeral. He had used the phrase, "the right time to move," which in Connor's professional vocabulary meant he had been waiting for a specific condition to be met, and that condition had now been met. What I needed to know, whether my mother was involved, whether any legal authority to make decisions had been established, and most urgently, what, if anything, my father had put in place before he died. Because here is something only I knew, or that I believed only I knew. My father was not a careless man. He was not a man who left important things to chance or to the goodwill of people he understood imperfectly. He had spent 40 years measuring twice and cutting once, in wood and in life, and I could not make myself believe that a man who said, "Don't let them rush," had not also done something, somewhere, to make the rushing matter less. I believed my father had prepared something. I did not know what, I did not know where, but I believed it, and I was going to find it. I went to bed at 1 a.m. and lay in the dark and thought about my father, and the workshop, and the last thing he said to me that I fully understood at the time, which was this, spoken on a Saturday morning 6 weeks before he died, both of us sanding the same piece of cherry wood, the workshop full of that specific golden late summer light. The best joint I ever learned is the one that holds even when the wood wants to pull apart. That's not the glue, Nathan. That's the cut. You have to cut it right from the beginning. He was not talking about woodworking. He never was when he said things like that. Before I tell you what happened to the workshop, I need to take you inside it. Not metaphorically, literally. I need you to stand in the doorway of a building on Alderwood Road in Portland, Oregon, on a Saturday morning in, let's say, October, because October was always the best month in that building, the light coming in at the angle that made the wood grains look like they were lit from inside. And I need you to understand what kind of place this was. The building itself was modest. Exterior modesty was one of my father's consistent traits. He had no interest in appearances for their own sake, in surfaces that signaled more than they contained. From the outside, it was a long, low structure, wood-sided, painted a dark green that had faded over the decades to a color that was more suggestion than declaration. A gravel parking area, a side door with hand-lettered sign, Callaway Custom Woodwork, by appointment. Inside was a different world entirely. My father had spent 40 years building that interior into exactly what he needed it to be, adding and adjusting and perfecting the way you perfect anything you love. Not in a single decisive renovation, but in the slow, patient accumulation of small improvements, each one calibrated to serve the work. The main floor was open, high-ceilinged, organized with the obsessive logical clarity of a man who believed that a workspace was a moral statement. Every tool had a place. Every surface was clean between projects. The smell, and this is the thing I cannot convey adequately in words, the thing that exists only as sense memory in my body even now, the smell of sawdust and linseed oil, and the particular dry warmth of wood shavings, a smell that I encountered for the first time at age 4, and which has, ever since, meant something that language is not quite adequate to contain. Safety. That is the closest word. Not safety in the physical sense, though my father was meticulous about that too. Safety in the deeper sense. The feeling of being in a place where the rules were clear, where quality was the only currency that mattered, where a person was valued for the patience and care they brought to the work. In a childhood that contained various forms of uncertainty, my parents' marriage was not always smooth, Connor's presence was not always easy, school was not always kind, the workshop was the one place where I knew exactly what I was supposed to be and was allowed to be it. My father began bringing me to the workshop on Saturdays when I was 4. Not to help, initially. I was 4, I could not help. I was a small person with large curiosity and an underdeveloped relationship with the concept of sharp objects. I sat on a wooden stool near the workbench and I watched. That was the arrangement. My father would explain what he was doing as he worked, narrating his process in the measured, specific way he narrated everything, and I would watch with the complete, unblinking attention of a child who has found the thing that holds him. By 7, I was sanding. By 10, I could use the hand plane with something approaching competence. By 13, I had built my first complete piece, a small bookshelf, 3 shelves, mortise and tenon joints, that my father examined for a long, silent moment before saying, "That'll hold." 2 words, my father. I understood them to be the equivalent of a standing ovation. The apprenticeship was informal and total. It was not scheduled or structured in any way that could be called deliberate. It simply happened over years with the organic inevitability of 2 people who share a language spending time in the space where that language is spoken. I learned not just the technical vocabulary of woodworking, but my father's entire way of approaching a problem, the patience, the precision, the deep suspicion of shortcuts, the belief that the thing you make should outlast the making of it. Connor came to the workshop twice, both times before he was 12. Both times he was visibly bored within an hour and asked to leave. My father drove him home without comment, returned alone, and that was that. The workshop was never contested between us. It was simply, without discussion or declaration, understood to be where I belonged. As I got older and left for college and then settled in Portland, my relationship with the workshop changed in form, but not in substance. I came on weekends when I could. I came for the summers between college years. I came when something was difficult and I needed the specific medicine that the smell of that building and my father's steady workbench administered. We talked in the workshop in a way we could not talk anywhere else. My father was not, in most settings, an open man. He had the emotional vocabulary of someone who had been raised by people for whom feelings were private to the point of invisibility. But in the workshop, with his hands occupied and the work providing a kind of permission, he would talk about his life, his regrets, his observations about the world, about me, what he saw in me, what he hoped for me, in the careful, indirect way of a man who found direct emotional expression uncomfortable, but found its absence intolerable. Some of the most important things my father ever said to me, he said in that building. The difference between a craftsman and an amateur is not talent, it's the willingness to do it again when the first one isn't right. Don't be the kind of man who makes things look easier than they are. People who know how hard a thing is respect you more, not less. You have more of me in you than you think. Sometimes that will be difficult. Most of the time, I think, it will be useful. I wrote these down. I have them still, in a journal I kept during my 20s, the entries sparse and infrequent in the way of someone who is not naturally a writer, but who occasionally encounters something too important to trust only to memory. Connor's relationship with the workshop was precisely nothing. I do not say this with contempt. I understood, even as a teenager, that people come to things differently and that the workshop simply was not Connor's thing the way it was mine. He had other abilities, other interests. He was good at school, in the competitive, grade-focused way. He understood money and leverage intuitively from a young age. He was charming in groups in the way that my father and I were not, and he had built a professional life that used those qualities well. But the workshop held nothing for him. He had not visited it, as far as I knew, in over 15 years. He did not know the smell of it, or the logic of it, or the feel of the floor under his feet, in the place where the subfloor had a slight give from a moisture issue my father had repaired, but which still remembered the damage. He did not know any of it. He just knew what it was worth. $300,000, as it turned out, in a market where commercial zoning on Alderwood Road had made formerly modest properties suddenly desirable to developers and buyers who had absolutely no interest in what the buildings contained and every interest in what the land beneath them permitted. $300,000 was what 40 years of my father's life was worth to the people who saw it as a property rather than a place. And Connor who had been on the phone on the day of the funeral, Connor who had a contact who had been interested for 2 years, Connor knew exactly what to do with that number. What I keep returning to when I think about those first days after the funeral is how fast it moved. My father died on a Tuesday. The funeral was Friday. By Saturday evening, Connor was on the phone with a buyer's contact. By the following Wednesday, 6 days after we buried him, Connor had arranged a meeting with a real estate agent. I did not know this in real time. I found out later that the meeting had happened, that my mother had been present, that the conversation had moved quickly from exploring options to listing the property in a way that, had I been there, I would have slowed down. But I was not there. I had not been invited. This was the first time I understood, fully and without the protective uncertainty of maybe I'm misreading this, that my family had already assigned me a role in the settlement of my father's estate, and that role was not participant. I was going to be informed after the decisions were made. My father's voice, quiet and precise, came back to me that night as I sat in my apartment and tried to figure out what to do. Don't let them rush things. I had promised, and I intended to keep that promise, but to keep it, I was going to need to move quickly myself. The real estate listing went live on a Thursday, 11 days after my father's funeral. I found it by accident. I had been searching Alderwood Road properties online, not because I suspected a listing yet, but because I was trying to understand the market, trying to build the factual foundation I would need for whatever conversation was coming. I had been doing this methodically, the way I approached every problem that mattered, gathering information before forming conclusions, measuring before cutting. And there it was. Commercial property, Alderwood Road, Portland, OR. Long-established workshop building, commercially zoned, excellent development potential, $300,000. Contact Meridian Realty Group. 3 photographs. The exterior of the building my father had maintained for 4 decades, the gravel parking area, the side door with the hand-lettered sign, Callaway Custom Woodwork, by appointment, still visible in the photo, which struck me as either an oversight or an irony so complete it looped back around to something else entirely. I sat at my laptop and I looked at those photographs for a long time. The listing had been live for 2 days. I had not been told. I called my mother first. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Her voice had the careful quality it had carried since the funeral, grief layered over something else, something more guarded, which I had registered but not yet fully interpreted. "Nathan," she said. "The workshop is listed, Mama," I said. I kept my voice level, not because I felt level, but because I had learned in my dealings with my family and with the world that the person who loses composure first loses the conversation. A pause, the specific pause of someone who knew this call was coming and had not known how to get ahead of it. "Connor handled the listing," she said. "We thought it was the right decision. The upkeep on that property, nobody told me. Nathan, we didn't think, nobody told me," I said again. Not louder, just again. Another pause. Longer. "It's a practical decision," my mother said. "The property generates expenses without your father there to run it. And the offer, Nathan, $300,000 is a significant... There's an offer already?" Silence. "Connor has been in contact with a buyer, a developer. They've been interested for some time. The offer is strong and..." I stopped listening for a moment. Not intentionally, my attention simply left the phone call and went to a Saturday morning in October in the workshop, my father's hands on a piece of cherry wood, the particular quality of the light. And we just thought it was the most practical... "Mama," I came back to the call. "I want a family meeting before anything closes. I want to sit down together and talk about this before any sale is finalized." A long silence. "I'll talk to Connor," she said finally. "I'd like you to talk to him today." The family meeting happened the following Saturday, my parents' house, the dining room table where I had eaten 10,000 meals, done homework, marked the slow passage of ordinary life. Connor arrived before me. I was 5 minutes late, which in retrospect was a tactical error, because 5 minutes gave him time to establish the room before I got there. He was already seated when I walked in, my mother across from him. Connor had a folder on the table in front of him, documents, organized in the efficient way of a man who has decided the outcome and is now managing the formality of discussion. He looked up when I entered. His expression was the one I had known my whole life. Not unkind, not deliberately hostile, but carrying the absolute certainty of someone who has never seriously entertained the possibility that he is wrong. "Nathan," he said, "glad you could make it." I sat down. Connor laid it out with the clean precision of a man presenting a business case. The property costs, taxes, insurance, maintenance, without my father's income were a net liability. The market timing was favorable. The developer's offer of $300,000, he said, was a strong number that might not hold if they waited. The estate needed to be settled, decisions needed to be made. He spoke for about 7 minutes. Then he looked at me and said, "I know it's emotional, but we have to be practical." I looked at him. "Who authorized you to list the property?" I said. A brief pause. "Mom and I discussed it." "I'm part of this family," I said. "I'm part of this estate." "The estate is being handled through the existing will, Nathan. Dad's will names Mom as primary executor. She has the authority to make these decisions." "I'd like to see the will," I said. Something moved in Connor's expression. Brief, controlled, but present. "Of course," he said. "We'll get you a copy." My mother was looking at the table. "Connor," I said, keeping my voice entirely even, "Dad built that workshop over 40 years. I worked there with him for 25 of those years. Before we sell it to a developer who is going to tear it down and build something else on that land, I want to make sure we're doing what Dad would have wanted, not what is most convenient, what he would have wanted. Connor leaned back slightly. Dad's gone, Nathan. What he would have wanted, it's just a building, Nathan, he said. And he said it in the tone I recognized, the gentle, reasonable, slightly condescending tone of someone who has decided that your emotional investment in something disqualifies your judgment about it. Dad's gone. The workshop without Dad is just a building, and a building costs money to keep. The room was quiet. My mother was still looking at the table. Just a building. I thought about the smell of it, the light on Saturday mornings, my father's voice narrating his process, patient and specific, to a 4-year-old on a wooden stool. I thought about the last Saturday I had been in that building, 6 weeks before he died, both of us sanding the same piece of cherry wood. I thought about what he had said. Don't let them rush things. I want 2 weeks before anything closes. 2 weeks, that's all I'm asking. Connor looked at our mother, a look that contained a full conversation. My mother said, quietly, 2 weeks, Connor. Connor gathered his folder. He looked at me with the patience of someone who has agreed to a delay they believe changes nothing. 2 weeks, he said. I drove to the workshop that afternoon. Not to interfere, not to photograph or document or take anything, just to be there, the way you visit something you love that you are afraid of losing. The key was on my keychain. It had been there for 11 years, placed there by my father on a Saturday morning with no ceremony. He had simply handed it to me and gone back to work, because in his world, giving someone a key to a place was the highest possible statement of trust and did not require elaboration. The door opened. The smell hit me, sawdust and linseed oil, and the dry warmth of wood shavings and 40 years of a man's life. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then I went in. I walked the full length of the main floor. Every workbench, every tool, every surface. I went to the back storage room, a long, low space behind the main workshop, partially shelved where my father stored materials and finished pieces waiting for delivery, the room I had been in hundreds of times. I stood in the back storage room and looked at the shelves, and then I looked at the wall behind the shelves. The panel. The false panel my father had built into the back wall 14 years ago on a Sunday afternoon when I was 17, and he had brought me into the workshop specifically to show me something. He had pressed a specific point on the lower right of what appeared to be a standard wall panel, and a section had swung inward on hidden hinges, and behind it was a recessed space roughly 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide, running floor to ceiling. He had put it in, he told me, for storage of documents and things that mattered. He showed me the mechanism. He told me it was mine to know about. He told me nobody else knew it was there. I had not thought about it in years. I thought about it now. I pressed the point on the lower right of the panel. It swung inward, and there, in the recessed space behind it, sitting exactly where it had always been, was a heavy steel safe I had never seen before. I stood in the open space behind the false panel and looked at the safe for a long time. It was not large, roughly the size of a microwave, heavy steel with a combination dial, the kind of safe you see in old offices and certain serious homes, built to last and built to resist. It sat on a low wooden platform my father had clearly built specifically for it, level, stable, positioned at a height that would make the combination dial easy to reach. It was not new. The steel had the slight patina of something that had been sitting in that space for years. I do not know how long I stood there, long enough for the light in the storage room to shift slightly, the afternoon moving toward evening outside the workshop's high windows. I was not ready in that moment to open it. I want to be honest about this, not because I was afraid of what was inside, but because the discovery of the safe itself was already more than I had prepared for, and I have always been someone who does not rush the significant moments. My father had taught me that. The joint that holds is the one you cut right from the beginning. You do not cut right by moving faster than your understanding allows. I pressed the panel back into place. I locked the workshop. I drove home. That night, I did not sleep. Not with anxiety exactly. The feeling was not anxious. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something large, unable to see its full shape, knowing that when morning came and you could see it, everything would be different. My father had built that panel when I was 17. He had shown me the mechanism, told me the space was mine to know about, said nobody else knew it was there, and then at some point after that, after I was 17, after I had grown up and moved to Portland and established my adult life, he put a safe inside that space, without telling me it was there. Which meant he either forgot, which I did not believe because my father forgot nothing practical, or he put it there after we had the conversation about the panel, which meant he had built the panel's privacy into a larger plan, using the space I already knew about to hold something he needed me to find. Find. Not be given. Not be handed. Find. Because if he had wanted me to have it immediately, handed over, he would have handed it over. He was not a man of unnecessary complexity. Everything he did had a reason. The reason, I thought, lying awake in my apartment with the city quiet outside my window, was this. He needed it to be undiscoverable by people who didn't know where to look, and findable by the one person who did. He had built a system. He had built it for me, and now I needed to open it. The combination. This was the thing I lay in the dark and searched my memory for, because my father had, I was certain he had, told me, but the conversation had happened 14 years ago, and I had not thought about it since. I went back to the Saturday afternoon when I was 17, the workshop, the panel, the space behind it, my father showing me the mechanism with the calm precision he brought to explaining anything technical. What had he said after? We had been standing in the storage room. He had closed the panel. He had turned to me. If there's ever anything important in there, Nathan, the combination will be something you know. Something I know. Not something he told me, something I know. I lay in the dark and thought about what my father believed I knew. Numbers, dates, the measurements of the things we had built together. He had made me memorize certain dimensions, certain ratios that appeared in classic woodworking proportions as training exercises. The year he had bought the workshop, the year I was born, my grandfather's birth year, the address of the workshop, dimensions of the first piece I had built, the bookshelf, 3 shelves, mortise and tenon. I ran through them, lying there, not impatiently, methodically, the way he had taught me. And then, not dramatically, not as a sudden flash, but as the quiet, certain arrival of something that had been there all along. I thought of the numbers he had made me memorize on my first full day as his apprentice. Not a date, not an address, the golden ratio as an expression he had written on a strip of masking tape and stuck to my first workbench, making me copy it in my notebook until I had it correctly. Every beautiful thing is built on this, he had said. Remember it. I remembered it. I went back to the workshop the next morning, early, the city still gray and quiet, a light rain on the drive over, the gravel parking lot empty. I unlocked the door. I went through the main floor without stopping, through the storage room, to the back wall. I pressed the panel mechanism. It swung inward. I crouched in front of the safe. I entered the combination, slowly, precisely, the way my father had taught me to do anything that mattered. The dial turned, the mechanism engaged, the safe opened. I want to tell you what it felt like when the door swung open, because I think the feeling matters as much as the contents. It felt like my father was in the room. Not in any supernatural sense. I am not a person prone to that kind of thinking, and my father would have been quietly skeptical of it too. But in the concrete, physical sense that a room can contain a person's presence through the objects they have deliberately placed there. The sense that every item inside that safe had been chosen and arranged by the same hands that had built the workbench and the panel and the platform the safe sat on. His hands had touched everything inside. His intention was in every document. He was there in the only way the dead can be anywhere, through the choices they made while they were alive. I took a breath. I looked at what was inside. On the top, immediately visible, was an envelope, cream-colored, sealed with tape, my name written on the front in my father's handwriting. the careful, upright print of a man who had learned to write before cursive was optional and had kept it all his life. Nathan. Just my name. Beneath the envelope, a stack of documents, organized with the characteristic precision of a man who had spent 40 years filing cut lists and material orders and client invoices. A brown accordion folder, its clasp closed. And beneath the accordion folder, visible at an angle, a small, flat object wrapped in a piece of workshop cloth, the gray cotton cloth he used to apply linseed oil to finished pieces. I took the envelope first. I held it for a moment. Then I put it carefully in my jacket's interior pocket, against my chest, which felt right, which felt like the only correct place for it to be. I took the accordion folder. I relocked the safe. I reset the panel. I locked the workshop, and I drove home with my father's last words to me sitting against my heart in a cream envelope in my jacket pocket, unopened, preserved for a moment when I could receive them with the full attention they deserved. That moment came that evening, and what I read changed everything. I opened the envelope at my kitchen table at 7 p.m. I had spent the day in a particular state, not agitated, not distracted, but suspended, moving through the ordinary requirements of the day with one part of my mind, while another remained entirely with the cream envelope propped against the fruit bowl on my kitchen counter, where I had placed it when I got home and where I had looked at it periodically throughout the afternoon. I made dinner. I ate it. I washed the dishes. Then I sat down at the table and I opened the envelope. My father had written 4 pages in his careful, upright print on the workshop stationery he had used for client correspondence for 30 years, a simple letterhead, Callaway Custom Woodwork, the Alderwood address, the phone number that had not changed in 4 decades. I am not going to read you every word. Some of what he wrote is mine alone, private in the way that a father's final words to his son are private, not secret, but personal to a degree that requires protection. But I will tell you what he said that matters to this story, because it all matters to this story. He began by telling me he was sorry, not for any single thing. He listed no specific failures, offered no itemized apology. He said he was sorry for the times he had communicated what he felt about me through the work, rather than through words, because he knew, he said, that words were what a son needed, and that he had always found them harder than dovetail joints, and had let that difficulty become an excuse for too long. He said he was proud of me. He said this plainly in the first paragraph, without qualifying it or embedding it in conditions, which was unlike him, and which therefore hit me with a force I had not prepared for. I had to put the letter down for a moment. I sat in my kitchen, and I did something I had not done since the parking lot of the church. When I was able to continue, I did. Then he explained. He had made a new will. Not the will Connor had referenced at the family meeting, the older document, drafted when my father's estate was simpler and the assumptions baked into it reflected a different understanding of the future. A new will, drafted 18 months before his death, when he understood that the illness was real and the timeline was not generous. He had not told my mother about the new will. He had not told Connor. He had worked with an attorney, a man named David Rice, whose card was paperclipped to the letter, in private, because he had understood, he wrote, that there were dynamics in his family that, without pressure, without the particular distortions that family interest applies to the making of important documents. The new will was in the accordion folder. Along with the new will, property deeds, account statements, and a document I had not expected, a deed of transfer for the workshop property itself, already drafted and partially executed, naming me as the designated recipient of the Alderwood Road property upon his death. He had, before he died, taken legal steps to transfer the workshop to me directly. Whether those steps were complete, whether the deed was fully executed and recorded, or whether it required additional steps that his death had interrupted, I did not know yet. That was a question for an attorney, but the intent was unambiguous. The documentation was real. He had tried to give me the workshop. He explained his reasoning in the letter in the careful, measured way he explained everything. He said the workshop had always been mine in meaning, and he wanted it to be mine in law. He said he had watched me grow up in that building and had understood, in a way he had not always known how to say, that the craft we had shared was the most important thing he had to pass on. Not the object, not the building itself, but the tradition it contained, the 40 years of learned patience and precision that lived in those walls, and that would, he believed, continue to live in me. He said he had not wanted it sold. He said specifically, do not let the building be sold to people who don't know what it is. If you decide to sell it one day, that is your right, Nathan, not anyone else's. He had written this 13 months before he died. He had written it knowing, because he knew his family, because he was a careful man who measured things accurately, that the decision would be contested, that there would be a rush, that someone would call a buyer's contact the day of his funeral. He had prepared for this the way he prepared for everything that mattered. He had built a joint that would hold. I read the letter 3 times that night. Between the second and third readings, I called David Rice, the attorney named on the paper-clipped card. I got his voicemail, it was evening, of course, and I left a message that was as calm and specific as I could make it, identifying myself, explaining that I was James Calloway's son, that I had found documents in my father's workshop that I needed to discuss urgently, and asking for a return call at his earliest opportunity. He called back the next morning at 8:15. David Rice was a man of about 60, I would later learn when I met him in person, compact and precise, with the particular manner of an estate attorney who has spent decades in the specific intersection of law and family grief, professional without being cold, direct without being unkind. He had known my father for 3 years. He said this in our first call, with a warmth that told me the professional relationship had developed into something with more texture. I've been waiting to hear from someone. I want to be careful about what I say on the phone before I've seen the documents, but I will tell you this. Your father was extremely deliberate about everything we prepared together. He thought about it carefully. He came back twice to revise certain language. He was a thorough man. He was, I said. Bring me everything from the safe, all of it. Can you come in today? I was in his office by 10 a.m. I spread the contents of the accordion folder on his conference table. The new will, 4 pages, dated, signed, witnessed by 2 signatures I did not recognize, which Rice examined with careful attention before nodding. Properly executed, witnessed correctly. This is valid. The property deed for the workshop, the deed of transfer naming me as the recipient. Rice examined this for longer. He asked me several questions about the timeline, the state of the transfer, whether anything had been filed with the county recorder before my father's death. He made a phone call. He was on hold for several minutes. He made notes. When he returned his attention to me, his expression was the carefully neutral expression of someone who has good news and is being responsible about how he delivers it. The deed of transfer was recorded. Your father filed it with the county recorder 11 months ago. The Alderwood Road property transferred to you legally at that point. He paused. The sale your family arranged, the listing with Meridian Realty, they were selling a property they no longer had legal authority to sell. The conference room was very quiet. The property is yours. It has been yours for 11 months. I sat with that for a moment. 11 months. My father had transferred the workshop to me 11 months ago, quietly, through proper legal channels, without saying a word to anyone in the family. He had known. he had planned. He had cut the joint right from the beginning, months before the illness took its final form, months before a Tuesday morning in September when the light came through the curtains and a man who had built beautiful things his whole life stopped building them. He had made sure. There was one more thing in the accordion folder, a bank statement for an account I had not known existed, a savings account held in a small regional bank in my father's name with a beneficiary designation that named me as sole recipient upon his death. The balance was not a fortune. It was not a number that would change the material shape of my life in any dramatic way, but it was significant. It was the accumulated savings of a man who lived carefully and spent it modestly and put aside over years what he could for a son he trusted to use it well. And beside the bank statement, in my father's handwriting on a strip of masking tape, the same masking tape he had used for labels in the workshop his entire career, "For what comes next, Dad." I held that strip of tape in my hands. For what comes next. He had planned for what came next. He had thought about it and prepared for it and protected it quietly from the rush and the practicality and the people who would have moved fast and called it sensible. He had given me from beyond a Tuesday morning in September the same thing he had given me on every Saturday morning in the workshop for 25 years, a foundation, something to build on, something to build with. David Rice was methodical. This is the quality I respected most in him, and the quality that, in the days following my first visit to his office, proved most valuable. He did not rush toward confrontation. He did not treat the legal clarity of my father's documents as a weapon to be deployed immediately before every implication was understood and every step correctly sequenced. He was, in this respect, exactly the kind of attorney my father would have chosen, a man who measured twice. We met 3 times in the week following my discovery of the safe. Each meeting was specific and structured. The first established the documents. The second confirmed the legal standing of each one through the appropriate verifications, the will's proper execution, the deed's recorded status, the bank account's beneficiary designation. The third meeting was the one where Rice laid out the complete picture and helped me understand not just what was true, but what it meant in practical terms. "Let's go through it completely," Rice said at the third meeting. He had the documents organized on the conference table, annotated in his precise handwriting with notes from his verification process. "The will your family has been operating from is the document your father prepared approximately 9 years ago. It names your mother as primary beneficiary with standard provisions. It was a reasonable document for its time." He moved to the new will. "This document supersedes the earlier one. It is dated correctly, signed correctly, witnessed by 2 independent witnesses who have been contacted and confirmed the execution. This is your father's final valid will." He walked me through the specific provisions. The Helm, the house on Birchwood Court where my parents had lived for 31 years, remained in my mother's name as before. My father had not changed that. He had understood, Rice said, that my mother's security in the home was a separate matter from the questions he was trying to resolve. The workshop property, already transferred by deed, legally mine for 11 months. The new will confirmed this and added a specific notation. "It is my wish that Callaway Custom Woodwork be continued or honored in whatever form my son Nathan deems appropriate. The craft belongs to him." The bank account, designated to me as sole beneficiary, passing outside the estate entirely through the beneficiary designation, not subject to the will's provisions at all. There were also specific items from the workshop itself: tools, client records, the commission book of completed projects going back to 1984, listed by name in the new will as designated to me. My father had been specific to the point of listing individual tools by manufacturer and model number. I looked at that list and something in my chest did a complicated thing. He had sat somewhere, at the kitchen table or in the workshop or in Rice's conference room, and he had thought about every object and written each one down. The number 4 Stanley bench plane he had owned since 1981, the marking gauge he had made himself from a piece of rosewood, the Japanese pole saw he had bought on a trip to a woodworking conference in Seattle. He had thought about each one and made sure I would have it. "The sale," I said. "The Meridian Realty listing." Rice nodded carefully. "Your family listed a property they did not legally own. Your mother, as executor of the earlier will, would have had authority to make decisions about estate property. But the workshop was not estate property. It had transferred 11 months ago. The listing was made in error, based on an incorrect understanding of what the estate contained." "The developer's offer," I said. "The $300,000. No contract has been signed to my knowledge. A listing is not a sale. Has a purchase agreement been presented?" "I did not know. I said so. We need to move quickly before anything is executed. I will send a letter today to the listing agent and to your family's attorney. I assume they have an attorney involved at this point, notifying that the Alderwood Road property is not a valid asset of the estate and that any attempted sale would be legally problematic. That stops the clock." He was already writing as he spoke. "What happens to the sale?" I said. "It cannot proceed," he said simply. "Not without your consent. You are the owner. Any sale of that property requires your signature, no one else's." The conference room was quiet. My father had built this. He had sat in this room or one like it, and he had made sure that when the rush came, and he had known it would come, there would be a structure in place that the rush could not override. A legal structure, carefully built with proper joints. That would hold. Rice sent the letters that afternoon. He called me the following morning. "I've heard from the listing agent," he said. "They've pulled the listing pending clarification. I've also had a call from an attorney representing your brother." Connor had a lawyer. I had expected this. "What did they say?" "They're questioning the validity of the deed transfer," Rice said. "Standard challenge. They'll argue it was executed when your father's capacity was compromised, or that it was made under undue influence, and both. These are the available arguments when the documentation is otherwise sound. Can they succeed?" A careful pause. "The deed was filed 11 months ago. Your father was not ill 11 months ago, not visibly, not diagnosed. His capacity was not in question at the time of execution. The deed was handled through a proper attorney process, witnessed and recorded. The challenge will be difficult to sustain." He paused again. He said, "I want to be honest with you," he said. "These things can be contested. It takes time. It costs money. Your family could make this harder than it needs to be." Another pause. "But the documents are strong. Your father was thorough. I have worked in this practice for 30 years, and I do not often see documents prepared with this level of care by a private individual. He understood what he was doing, and he did it correctly." "He measured twice," I said. A brief silence. "Yes," Rice said. "He did." I had 1 week between Rice's letters going out and the family meeting. I did not contact my mother during that week, not because I was punishing her, I was not, or I was trying not to be, but because I needed the week to prepare, and because any contact before the meeting would have become a negotiation I was not ready to have. I thought about what I wanted from the meeting. Not tactically, I was past tactics, or I was trying to be, but genuinely. What did I want to be different when it was over? I wanted my mother to know what my father had intended, the full truth of it, not the filtered version that had been constructed by the rush and the listing and the developer's offer, but the actual thing my father had actually done and actually meant. I wanted Connor to understand that what he set in motion had been based on a fundamental error, not about my father's property, but about my father, about who he had trusted and what he had built and what he had understood about his own family's tendencies. I wanted to do this without cruelty, without the performance of having won something, because I had not won anything. My father had died, and nothing that came after changed that central, permanent fact. What I had was not a victory. It was an inheritance. An inheritance it was my responsibility to carry correctly. On the evening before the meeting, I went back to the workshop one more time. I unlocked the door. I stood inside for a long time in the dark, not turning on the lights, letting the smell do what it always did, take me somewhere specific and irretrievable, to a Saturday morning and a wooden stool and a 4-year-old watching his father work. I found the light switch. The workshop came into view. I walked to my father's main workbench. The surface was clean. He had always left it clean. The last act of every session was clearing the bench, a ritual he had explained to me as respect for the work that comes next. On the bench, in the center, was a piece of cherry wood, half finished, still mid-project, the last thing his hands had worked on before the illness made the workshop impossible to reach. I had not noticed it on my previous visits, or I had not allowed myself to look at it directly. I looked at it now. It was the beginning of a small box, the sides cut, the joints marked but not yet cut, the wood beautiful and patient and waiting for the work that would not come from the hands that had started it. I put my hand on the wood. Tomorrow, I was going to walk into my parents' dining room with documents that would change everything my family thought they knew about my father's estate. But tonight, I stood in my father's workshop with my hand on a piece of cherry wood that he had not finished, and I made a quiet, private promise that had nothing to do with deeds or wills or the legal structure of what he had left me. I promised I would finish it. The box, the project, the half-made thing sitting on the bench. I would finish it, because that is what you do when someone gives you their tools and their space and 40 years of what they knew. I arrived at the house on Birchwood Court at 10 a.m. on Saturday. David Rice was with me. This had been his suggestion, not mine. I had initially resisted the idea, feeling that bringing an attorney to a family meeting carried an escalatory message I did not want to send. Rice had listened to my reasoning and then said, with the gentle precision of someone who has watched many families navigate exactly this kind of moment, "Nathan, the documents need to be presented by someone with legal authority to speak to them. If you present them alone, your brother will immediately challenge their authenticity, and the meeting will become an argument about the paper rather than the truth. I am there as a witness to the documents, not as a combatant. It makes a significant practical difference." He was right. I knew he was right. I agreed. We parked behind Connor's car in the driveway. The house smelled the way it had always smelled. Coffee, the particular cleaning product my mother had used on the hardwood floors for 30 years, the kind of smell that reaches back through time and touches something structural in you regardless of the circumstances of the visit. My mother met us at the door. She looked at Rice with the tearful expression of someone who had been told an attorney was coming and had decided to receive that information without reaction. She was composed. She had always been composed in the public-facing way of women who learned early that composure was a form of protection. She hugged me, briefly, tightly, with the specific quality of a hug from someone who is both glad you're there and afraid of what you've brought with you. She said, "Connor is in the dining room." The dining room, the table where I had eaten 10,000 meals. Connor was seated at the far end, which in a room like this communicated a positioning that I recognized as deliberate. The end of the table implies authority over it. He had a man beside him I did not recognize, who was introduced as his attorney, a compact man in his 40s named Gerald. Rice acknowledged Gerald with the professional courtesy of two people who have been on opposite sides of things before and understand the choreography. We sat, my mother at the side, between us, which felt accurate. Connor looked at me with the expression I had been preparing for, measured, professional, radiating the certainty of a man who believed he was managing a situation rather than being surprised by one. I want to start by saying that nobody in this family has any intention of doing anything that isn't in everyone's best interest. We've had some legal questions raised about the estate, and I think if we talk through them— Connor, I said. He stopped. I opened the leather folder I had brought. I placed the documents on the table. Not dramatically. I placed them the way my father placed finished pieces on a workbench for inspection, with care and without performance. The new will, the recorded deed, the bank account beneficiary statement. Rice spoke for approximately 10 minutes. He addressed each document in turn, confirmed its legal status, explained its implications. He was precise and unhurried and completely clear. The room was quiet throughout. Connor's attorney Gerald examined the deed with particular attention. He made notes. He asked Rice 2 questions about the recording date and the witnessing of the will. Rice answered both without hesitation. The silence that followed was the silence of a room absorbing information it had not expected. Connor recovered first. He was not a man who absorbed things passively. The deed transfer, 11 months ago. That was shortly after the initial diagnosis. There are questions about his capacity, Rice said, anticipating the argument. Yes, the deed was executed on a specific date. I have the medical records for that period, obtained with Nathan's assistance and appropriate consent. Your father was not on any medication that affects judgment on that date. His diagnosis had been made, but treatment had not begun. His capacity was not in question. He paused. I anticipated this challenge, and I have the documentation to address it. Connor was quiet. The listing, I said. The sale. You were selling a property you didn't own. Connor's jaw tightened. We didn't know. I know you didn't know. And I meant it. I was not performing generosity. I genuinely believed Connor had not known about the deed, about the safe, about any of it. He moved fast and efficiently on the basis of what he understood the situation to be, and what he understood was wrong. I'm not saying you did it deliberately. I'm saying it needs to stop. Gerald spoke for the first time quietly to Connor. Something low, something I couldn't hear. Connor sat back.
My mother had said nothing. She had been silent since we sat down, her hands on the table, her eyes moving between the documents and my face, with an expression I could not fully read. Something that contained grief and guilt, and something older, something that might have been the particular pain of a woman confronting evidence of how well her husband knew the dynamics of his own family. I looked at her. "Mama," I said, "he wrote you a letter too, in the safe." Her eyes went very still. "I have it. It's yours. I haven't read it. It was addressed to you. I wouldn't read it." I reached into the interior pocket of my jacket, the second envelope from the safe. Cream-colored, my mother's name in my father's handwriting. I had been carrying it since the day I opened the safe, waiting for this moment. I slid it across the table to her. She picked it up with both hands. She looked at my father's handwriting on the front. And my mother, who had been composed through the funeral, through the listing, through the attorney's letters and whatever conversations had happened in the week since, was no longer composed. She pressed the envelope against her chest. She closed her eyes. Connor watched his mother and was, for the first time in this process, completely still. Not strategically still, not the stillness of a man waiting to make his next argument. Simply still the way people go still when something real is happening and there is nothing useful to do except witness it. I watched my brother in that moment, and I saw something I had not seen in a long time. Underneath the commercial confidence, underneath the efficiency and the speed and the folder of documents on the table at the funeral reception, underneath it all, he was a son who had just watched his mother hold a letter from their dead father against her heart. We were all just children in this room, children of a man who had known us clearly enough to prepare for exactly this moment. The legal meeting that followed lasted another hour. The practical outcomes were established in terms that Reese and Gerald negotiated with the professional calm of men who understood their clients needed resolution more than victory. The listing was officially withdrawn. The developer's offer was formally declined. The estate would be administered according to the new will. The workshop property, legally mine for 11 months, remained mine. Connor did not contest further. I want to believe, and I think I have enough basis to believe, that something shifted in him in the moment his mother held that envelope, something that moved him past the argument and into the territory where the argument no longer felt like the point. He looked at me before he left. "I didn't know about any of it," he said, not as a defense, as a statement of fact. "I know," I said. A pause. He was more careful than I gave him credit for. Quietly, the specific quiet of a person saying something that costs him something. He was always that careful. We just didn't always see it. Connor nodded. He picked up his folder. He left. My mother and I sat at the dining room table for a long time after everyone had gone. She had opened the letter in private. She had asked me for a few minutes alone, and I had gone to the kitchen, and when I came back, her eyes were red, but she was composed again, in the deeper way, the real way, the way of someone who has received something they needed. She did not tell me what the letter said. I did not ask. We sat in the quiet of the house, the familiar smell of it around us, and we talked for 2 hours, not about the estate, not about the documents, about my father. About the things we remembered, about the workshop and the mornings and the smell of sawdust and what it had meant that he had built things his whole life and left them behind for people to live inside. She told me she had known, in some part of herself she had not examined, that he would have made arrangements for the workshop, that she had let Connor move forward partly because she was grieving, and partly because the grief had made practical clarity difficult, and partly because she was a woman who had trusted the people around her to manage things, which was a strength and a way of not looking too directly at what she already sensed. "You loved him very much," she said. The most direct thing she had ever said to me about my father's feelings, the most direct thing she needed to say. "I know," I said. And I did. I had known for a long time, in the way you know a thing that has never been said in words, through the Saturday mornings and the handed-over key and the combination that was something I knew and the safe that held a cream envelope with my name on the front. I had always known. The workshop is still standing. I want to tell you that first, because it matters. The building on Alderwood Road with the dark green siding and the gravel parking area and the hand-lettered sign, Callaway Custom Woodwork, by appointment, is still there. And the sign is still there. And on Saturday mornings, the light still comes through the high windows at the angle that makes the wood grains look lit from inside. I go there most weekends. Not always to work, sometimes just to be in it. The way you return to places that hold people you have lost. The smell is unchanged. The workbench is the same workbench. The tools are on their hooks in the same positions my father kept them, because I have kept them there, because the organization of those tools is a kind of language I am not willing to let go quiet. I finished the cherry box. It took me 3 weekends. I sat at my father's bench with his tools, and I followed the marks he had made, the joints he had laid out but not cut, the proportions he had worked out in the light pencil lines on the wood surface, and I cut what he had marked and assembled what he designed, and finished the surface with his linseed oil and his wool cloth. It is not a perfect box. There's a slight gap in one of the corner joints that a better craftsman would not have left, but it is finished and it is whole, and it sits on the workbench where he left it, complete now. I think he would have accepted the corner joint. He accepted always the honest imperfection of a genuine attempt over the false perfection of something not tried. The workshop is operating again. Modestly, for now, I have a day job in Portland that I am not ready to leave, and I'm learning to run the craft side carefully, the way my father ran everything. I have taken on 3 commissions in the past 4 months. Small pieces, all of them, within my current level of skill, a side table, a set of bookshelves, a jewelry box for a woman who found the workshop's original website and called the number that still worked. When she called, she said, "Is this Callaway Custom Woodwork?" I said yes. She said, "I had a cabinet made here 20 years ago. Is James still there?" I told her James had passed. A pause. "I'm sorry," she said. "He was wonderful.
His work was wonderful. "Thank you," I said. "I'm his son. I'm carrying it forward." A longer pause. And then, "I'd like to commission something." I want to tell you what I learned from all of this. Not as rules, not as a tidy list with a bow on it, but as what I actually genuinely learned in the specific way that experience teaches things that no amount of prior knowledge can substitute for. The first thing, some preparations only make sense in retrospect. My father built the false panel when I was 17. He put a safe behind it at some point after that. He drafted a new will, transferred the deed, designated the bank account, over years, quietly, without announcing any of it. Each individual step taken alone would not have been comprehensible as part of a plan, but in retrospect, from the vantage point of a dining room table where the documents were spread out and the ground had shifted, it was the most complete and careful plan I had ever seen. He had been preparing not for his death, but for what would happen after it. Not for grief, but for the specific dynamics of his specific family. He had known, with the quiet, clear-eyed knowledge of a man who had spent 64 years paying attention, what would happen when he was gone, and he had built something that could hold against it. This taught me something about the difference between pessimism and preparation. My father was not a pessimist. He loved his family. But he was honest about it, about what it was and what it tended toward, and that honesty allowed him to act in a way that love alone, without honesty, would not have enabled. The second thing, the things built in private are often the strongest. The workshop, the will, the deed, the bank account, the letter. None of it was built in public. None of it was announced or discussed or presented for approval. My father did all of it in the specific privacy of a man who trusted his own judgment more than he trusted the comfort of consensus. And every piece of it held. The public decisions, the rush, the listing, the developer's offer, the meeting in the house with the attorney, those were the things that unraveled. The private things, built carefully, cut right from the beginning, held exactly as they were meant to hold. I think about this when I am in the workshop, when I am working on a joint that needs to hold without glue, when the wood wants to pull apart, and the only thing between holding and failing is the quality of the cut. You do the work correctly, in private, if that is where it needs to be done, without audience, without applause. You cut it right. The third thing, the letter mattered as much as the deed. This is the one I think about most. My father could have transferred the deed and designated the bank account and said nothing. The legal documents would have accomplished everything they accomplished, and the workshop would still be mine, and the sale would still have been stopped. But he wrote the letters, 4 pages to me, something private to my mother. He sat somewhere and found the words that were hard for him, and he wrote them down. And he put them in a cream envelope, and he locked them in a safe behind a panel that only I knew about. He did not trust the legal documents alone. He understood that legal structures accomplish practical outcomes, but that what people carry forward from loss is not determined by practical outcomes. What we carry forward is meaning, the story we understand ourselves to be living, the sense of being known by the people who loved us. He gave me the workshop, but what he gave me first, in 4 pages of careful print, was the knowledge that he had seen me, that the 40 years of Saturday mornings and wooden stools and straight A grain and joints that held, that he had understood what they were for both of us. That is worth more than the deed. That is the thing I would not trade for anything the safe contained. The fourth and final thing, what you build is what you leave behind. My father built furniture. He built a workshop. He built a plan, patiently and carefully over the last years of his life. He built a letter, 4 pages of words that cost him more than any dovetail joint ever had. And he built a son who knew how to find what he had hidden. Not because of any single lesson, not because of the combination he whispered during a workshop session, though that mattered, but because of 25 years of Saturday mornings in a man communicated everything important about himself through the quality of his attention, and a boy received all of it. The best thing my father built was the relationship in which none of this needed to be explained. I knew the combination because I knew my father. I knew my father because I had paid attention for 25 years in the only classroom he ever really taught in, a workshop on Alderwood Road with sawdust on the floor and light coming through the high windows and the smell of linseed oil, and a man who showed me, without ever quite saying so, how to build things that hold. My name is Nathan. I am 31 years old and I live in Portland, Oregon. My family sold my father's workshop before they understood that it was already mine. And in a safe behind a panel that only I knew about, my father left me everything I needed to keep building. Not the money, not the deed, not even the workshop, though I am grateful for all of it. What he left me was proof that he saw me. That is the thing you cannot deed to anyone. That is the thing nobody can sell. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe for a new story every week. And if you have ever been the one your family didn't see coming, leave a comment. I read every one.